centering energy where it is not necessary, where it literally and actually does more harm than good. Energy is to be centered only for emergency. And when it is otherwise centered, it is of little value. Also, the magnetic field becomes an immediate carrier of mental impulse, much more rapid and much more powerful than any conscious process can be. A good example of this is learning to play the piano. The individual must go through a considerable preliminary period of training. The purpose of the training being to gradually eliminate hand consciousness. As long as he must guide his hands by an active process of volition, he will be slow and stumbling in his music. When, however, he reaches the point where the hands react automatically to the impulses of the mind and will, so that they become comparatively unknown to him, but serve him effectively, then he becomes a more satisfactory artist. It seems then that mental energy can be carried almost instantaneously to any part of the body where it is needed, and that this subjective method of communication with the parts of the body is more necessary and more important than any conscious willing of these parts to perform a specific action. The next point, again, follows from these, and that is that the mind, being able to direct energy, is subject to certain limitations and infirmities of its own, by means of which the direction of energy may be wrong or may miscarry. Or in the case of the magnetic healer, there is always the possibility that a preconception of the nature of the ailment, a faulty diagnosis, a demand for the use of energy in a certain way may bring the patient difficulty rather than improvement. It is therefore true in this as in all other things that the energy field of the patient must determine the patient's need and not the intellectual attitudes of the physician. This is subtle and takes away from the field some of its most interesting aspects. We are curtailed in our glorious privilege of exerting mind over matter. We are no longer set up as arbitrary determinants of what others need. We have so long attempted to diagnose by formula, by tradition, by precedent, and by certain schools of technique, that it has not occurred to us that the magnetic field of the patient is a living diagnosis at all times. You may remember, of course, the charming story, Caesar's Column, by Ignatius Donnelly. In this story, which anticipates the progress of man into the future with something of the spirit of Edward Bellamy, but perhaps not quite so optimistic, an invention is described resembling a watch, which the individual can wear as he would a watch, and can look at it whenever he feels like it, look at his watch and say, a little bilious today. That this magnetic instrument, small but powerful, will enable him to tell at any time the condition of his own health. The operation of the instrument, of course, depends upon magnetism. This has not yet quite been perfected. We might have done it by now had we not been more interested in reaching Mars or one of the other members of the remote solar family. But it is still conceivable that such a device could be devised. And it is even more important to remember that the magnetic field of the body must always present the true and inevitable condition of that body. Therefore, it is not the mind of the individual who is judging, nor is it the mind of the patient who is explaining his symptoms. It is actually the state of the electric currents of the body and their relation to the needs of the occasion. Thus, the tendency to create a highly arbitrary system of therapy is to a measure checked, and we begin to consider the various moral and ethical involvements. The individual can recover only when he ceases to cause his own sickness. If he ceases to cause it, he in all probabilities will be gradually relieved of its symptoms unless the damage has gone too far. Then he may be assisted, or he may be beyond assistance, as the case may be. But certainly the condition of the body is the result of a certain psychic pattern pressed upon the body by what Böhme calls a seal, the seal of the composite archetype of the character itself. The magnetist approaching this has only one of two or three courses open. He must either develop that kind of internal sight by means of which he can read the magnetic field accurately, and this particular ability is not always possible. He has a second recourse, and that is to merely provide the body with an additional amount of energy derived either from his own body or from some adequate source of magnetism. There is a third possibility, and this is perhaps the one that can come the closest to our present comprehension, and that is that it is conceivable and possible for the individual to feel or to sense without seeing, to know as though intuitively the condition of the magnetic field of another person. He thus is given the impulse. It may come into him and be interpreted with extraordinary clarity. In some cases, magnetists have actually experienced in various parts of their bodies the very pains from which their patients suffered. More usually, however, it is a kind of mental recognition, a recognition like a flash of inspiration, a recognition which is a sudden knowing, which would seem to imply, in turn, that the magnetic field of the other person was capable of sending a message or transmitting a message, which, flowing into the magnetic field of the physician, was transformed into a mental idea. Many so-called magnetic healers of modern times have described their abilities to diagnose as being this intuitive method, or this extraordinary circumstance of suddenly feeling in the corresponding part of their own bodies the ailments from which the sufferer complains. This type of cognition is itself apparently a transmission of magnetism through the nervous system. The next interesting phase of our problem begins the study of what can we do to take the place of thinking in order to control by the mind or by some attribute of consciousness the function of the magnetic field, either our own or someone else's. Early in the 19th century, it was pointed out that certain broad, general attitudes seemingly caused broad and genuine changes within the magnetic structure. and entirely apart from their interest in theology, these researchers came very close to the opinion of St. Paul as expressed in Corinthians. For it was learned through experience that the three most powerful emotional or mental projections by means of which therapy could be attained in the magnetic field were the three attitudes of faith, hope, and love. These were therapeutic. Hate destroyed. Love restored. Faith built or created. Fear or lack of faith destroyed. Hope was a creator. Despair, a destroyer. Now, in our conscious living, these various attitudes tumble about in almost constant confusion. At one moment we are hopeful, and the next we are fearful. In one moment we have faith, and in another moment we are faithless. But let us assume certain principles and see whether they make sense, perhaps better sense than we suspect. During the last 50 years, perhaps a little more, the civilizations which have led the world for centuries have gradually developed a powerful materialistic complex or culture. Until today, the leaders in our various walks of life are very often persons of little faith. They have not recognized the importance of strong, constructive belief in terms of health. Having lost much of their religious anchorage, and having no firm ethical structure to take its place, or to even help to compensate for its loss, we find it quite conceivable that the general lowering of the level of simple faith, faith in good, faith in right, faith in truth, faith in God, that the losses in these forms of faith might very well result in a general dilemma relating to magnetism. If the absence of faith is a loss, and if criticism in the place of faith is little less than a destroyer of energy, then negative attitudes, as they become more prominent, should cause us to be more exhausted. And I suspect that if we had a very accurate poll taken at this time, more persons would complain of being tired than ever before in history. This tire is not due to labor, for we have never probably had as great a possibility of leisure as we have now. Our exhaustion we credit to psychic fatigue and recognize it as a major ailment. If fatigue itself bears witness to a depletion or a wrong tidal motion, or even to the reversal of the current of a magnetic field, we may then assume that the tremendously increasing sense of doubt, of insecurity, of downright fear, combined with a loss of a natural tendency to cultivate sensitive, constructive attitudes, that the direct machinery by which our attitudes affect our flesh may be through the magnetic field. We may also assume that a collective magnetism where millions of persons holding certain negative attitudes create a common dilemma, might go so far as to affect adversely the magnetic field of the planet. For we cannot assume for a moment that man suffers alone. We have to also assume that his negative psychic and emotional attitudes affect the other kingdoms of nature around him. And we are even now concerned with various circumstances resulting in loss of harvests, in the failure of trees to bear good fruit, in the failure of many natural processes. We have assumed various causes, but it is possible that among these causes will be found the general inertia or depletion resulting from the collective effect of our own attitudes upon personal and earth magnetism. This may sound far-fetched, but it is no more far-fetched than the radio sounded 100 years ago, had anyone dared to discuss such a possibility. We are in an age where we are becoming aware of the sensitivities of life around us. This awareness must open us to considerations of substances and facts not hitherto regarded as legitimate or important. If then hope, faith, and love are therapeutic attitudes, it becomes evident that we have a scientific reason for faith. We have the proof that faith developed in man at some remote time because he intuitively recognized the need of faith. That faith came not from the imposings of the clergy, but came originally from the interior need for comfort. Not spiritual consolation alone, but simple physical comfort. That the individual then began to organize these primitive impulses to the formations of creeds and codes. This we can accept. But because all primitive peoples make use of various magical forms involving the control and directing of magnetism, even now, we may suspect that they were aware of the important facts. We talk of the importance today of a good attitude. We think of it, however, largely as a platitude. We have the feeling that if we have a good attitude, other people will like us better, that we will be more popular. This is no doubt true. But is this friendship that results from better attitude merely based upon this external situation, or is it based upon the change in the magnetic field which can be intuitively recognized by others? We know that persons of various temperaments have had adventures in life which would signify or indicate that their internal natures affected those around them. It is a common problem, for example, that does not infrequently arise, that certain physicians and nurses have better effects upon patients than others. This effect cannot be based upon appearance, for one may be as prepossessing as another. It cannot be based upon efficiency. They have all received more or less equal training. We may say that it could be based upon the attitude of the doctor or the nurse. But in some instances, they are at least certainly not aware of their attitude and are very hurt and disappointed when the patient does not respond favorably. Yet it is almost a certainty that if we leave a certain nurse with a certain patient, he may not recover. Something is wrong that cannot be corrected by efficiency, kindness, cheerfulness, or anything that we know. There seems to be an antagonism on the level of the magnetic field. Thus, certain persons in all relationships can be fortunate or unfortunate in terms of their own magnetism. Does this mean that such magnetic attractions and repulsions are inevitable? Does it mean that certain persons will never be able to get along together? Does this, to a certain degree, reflect itself in the comparatively high rate of divorce from which we suffer today? Is incompatibility, at least in part, an element of magnetism? I think it can be in a good many cases. There are also indications that there are people who cannot get along together, who will not be able to, or will never be able to make a sufficiently great adjustment in their own characters that they will be able to become compatible. This occurs not only in the more intimate associations, but also in business and in social activities. There are people that will never be drawn to each other. And if they are accidentally brought together, there is no spark of friendship or recognition. There is only, at best, an indifference. Now, the problem of indifference also plays a part in our magnetic theory. Energy moves with interest. It moves with concern. It moves with all kinds of active attitudes. It does not move, however, from indifference. Indifference is the ultimate degree of detachment. It means that there is no sympathy, no relationship, no common ground. It does not necessarily stand for an antagonism in the magnetic fields, but it very often prevents any interest or direction of energy by means of which an acquaintance or an association can be improved. Now, in religion, mysticism, philosophy, and these situations, indifference has never been regarded as a virtue. And when we refer to a certain kind, shall we say, of detachment, we do not imply indifference. Indifference is so completely lifeless that it calls and draws nothing. And quietude, or the suspension of attitudes, is not indifference. Indifference represents failure to report any stimulation or any activity of interest. Whereas man seeking to relax or to attain freedom from pressure is not working with indifference. To make a virtue of indifference would be equivalent to making a virtue of ignorance, or to assume that a not knowing is good. In nature, not knowing is never good. False knowing is also bad. Right knowing is very important. Indifference is not relaxation. Indifference is not protection. And the individual who becomes indifferent or attempts to get out of a situation by departing from it, physically and psychologically, will gain little benefit for himself. Rather than indifference, there must be a strong but perhaps rather impersonal sense of values. Again, this term is a little dangerous, for the impersonal individual may be without sympathies and sympathy is the principle upon which magnetism moves. Therefore, detachment must not and should not be unsympathetic. It becomes, therefore, necessary to refine and regulate values to the end that we hold the proper attitude toward ourselves and to all other creatures. That this attitude cannot be assumed merely by an action of the will or a determination of the mind is also evident. The attitude must become a total part of the life itself. The attitude must arise in consciousness and be communicated therefrom directly into the fields of energy which support the body. Researches by Mesmer and others have shown beyond doubt that the magnetic field to operate best must be in a state of tranquility. Tranquility simply means now normalcy, nothing more than or less. Excitation or the tremendous upsurge of intensity is not normalcy. Depression or the reduction of energy to the state perhaps of inertia is not normal. And one of the forces or circumstances which causes the greatest havoc in man's magnetic structure is uncontrolled and excessive emotional outbursts. These cannot do any good on any plane, and on the psychic plane they do much harm. This causes people to say, but these outbursts are natural to us. We might also say, by looking at the available text, particularly the World Almanac, that sickness and death are natural to us. Very few of us get out of this world alive, at least in terms of our physical existence. Things that are commonly done, habits that are commonly practiced, may be common but not natural. And we would not be in the difficulty we are in today if things commonly done gain virtue by the common doing. They do not. Things done badly never become a virtue, even though every other living being does them that way. So everything which causes explosion in the energy fields of the body will have an effect similar to an explosion in the earth, or to the explosion of a bomb, such as was dropped at Nagasaki or Hiroshima. These explosions cause tremendous cataclysm, and in our energy field, they are nearly always followed by intense depletion or depression. After one of these emotional outbursts, the victim simply says to his friends, neighbors, and enemies, "I feel terrible." Tired out, worn out, and ashamed of himself. This type of attitude, again, represents the waste of energy. And as energy is life, the waste of it is bad, especially bad when this waste, as in the case of an excessive outburst, immediately reacts upon the body, injuring its fabric, and thereby hastening its ultimate dissolution. In the same way, excessive grief, excessive worry, and fear cause immediate damage. And all irrational or unreasonable attitudes, attitudes that are unsympathetic, critical, defamatory, attitudes which are known in conscience not to be right, all have been proved to be magnetically bad. It then seems to be indicated that health to the individual can be very often greatly changed or helped by his own ability to direct energy. Man is not yet so completely endowed with understanding, self-control, organization, the ability to remain fair and reasonable and temperate in all his attitudes, that he is able to escape all of the ravages due to the, we will say, the corruption of his magnetic field. He can improve, however. Death is said by Milton to be the last great enemy, and it will probably be the last to be overcome. But man may certainly enjoy better years and have a greater sense of security as he gradually and in an orderly manner and according to his ability unfolds temperance within his own nature. By so doing, he reduces the wear and tear of life to its possible minimum so far as he is concerned. In this respect, likewise, we recognize that certain attitudes, having certain effects and results, may be associated in the correction of various ailments of the body. Records at an early time pointed out that there was a very strong and important magnetic sympathy between a mother and child. This magnetic sympathy was polarized through the thymus gland, by means of which a very powerful magnetic pole of the mother remained in the body of the child, active and operating till about the 7th year. Up to that time, maternal concern for a child can have greater effect and more immediate consequence than any other period of life. And there are definite cases in which a mother, confronted with a child desperately ill, has practically brought that child back to life by the immense concentration of its own devotion upon that child. There are also cases by reverse action, for it is by the sensitiveness of this gland that the child is psychically aware of the most secret emotions and thoughts of the mother, and may therefore be subjectively effective. It is in this case particularly important that the parent maintain, so far as is possible, a good attitude, a peaceful and tranquil attitude, at the time in the life of the child when the parent is most tempted not to have such an attitude due to the burden and pressure of the occasion. Thus, we may say that parenthood becomes a great test in magnetism. And we can't expect too perfect results, but any improvement will be appreciated by all concerned. Because the child at that time, bound through the thymus gland, is practically like an identical twin with the mother. And almost any thought or emotion of the parent will move into the child's mind. The child at that time is far more receptive to these thought and emotion pressures than to any word or visible example which the parent may give. Actually, as the thymus gland becomes symbolic, therefore, of a kind of psychic umbilicus between parent and child, so as the human being grows into his physical and intellectual maturity, most of the connections between his physical body and his magnetic field are associated with the other glands of the endocrine chain. The thymus gradually becomes non-operative in the normal person, and where it remains operative too long, it produces serious consequences. The particular area of the magnetic field in the human body is the spleen. And in the area of the spleen, these currents focus or center from the sources of energy supply. From the spleen, they form their own central dynamo and begin to radiate outward to form the magnetic field of the body. Most of this magnetism is therefore centered, as we pointed out before, in the abdominal area. And from this area, it spreads. Depletions of energy may therefore be most immediately recognized in digestion, assimilation, and excretion. And the effect of tension, stress, or negative mental and emotional attitudes upon these areas is particularly notable. For among the first indications of tension is the disruption of the digestive procedure. To restore that again is to release or break down tension areas. In another phase of our problem, the magnetic healer is sometimes confronted with an obstruction or a blockage in the flow of magnetism to one part of the body or another. Such obstructions may rise from several causes. They can be psychosomatic, for each part of the body, as Leonardo da Vinci pointed out, has a certain relationship to all other parts. One of the most simple analogies lies in the old distribution of the signs of the zodiac and the planets among the sections of parts of the body, as set forth in the familiar old cut-up man of the almanac, who is shown usually with the constellations grouped around him. This association, however, can be carried to much more intensive and definite degrees. Wherever magnetism is blocked, there is either a derangement or there has been a fatigue which has resulted in a process of crystallization. This process of crystallization inhibits the continuance of magnetism even after the fatigue has passed. This means that to meet this kind of a situation, special pressures or concentrations of magnetism may be necessary. As many obstructions in their earlier states are not attended by much noticeable pain, that type of warning which we find in connection with the outer surface of the body, wounds, scars, boils, and things of that kind, this type of warning is not available. There is, however, always some kind of warning. And the most common warnings are failures of processes, such as digestion and assimilation, minor disturbances of the heart, sense of tension, nerve, or stress, the gradual loss of the use of a member or part, or the failure of its function in the general biological economy. Wherever such situation arises, the magnetic healer has the tendency to try to exaggerate temporarily the current of magnetism in the body of the patient. Thus, we must assume that a successful magnetic healer must have considerable magnetism available to him. If his own supply is highly limited, or if he is unable to form a channel to the general source of magnetism, he will not be successful long, or if he is, will deplete himself and perhaps wreck his own health. Experimentation is the only way in which the magnetist can determine the degree in which he can expend energy with safety. Also, of course, as energy is expended, as in all the habit processes of nature, it is apt to increase. Therefore, the use of energy may cause the magnetist to find an ever-increasing supply. That is, if everything be right in the proposition. By sending energy specially into areas where it may have been depressed, or where the natural currents of the body are not able to break through, the magnetist can break up congestions, can stimulate sluggish functions, and can open the body to the remedial use of its own energy. Thus, the person, having been relieved of the obstruction may then be able to take over with his own energy fields. Now, we have mentioned the most common and universal sources of this magnetic force. We might, however, point out that there are certain other sources which can be and are important to the individual. One of the most common and familiar of all sources of magnetic energy is respiration. For by means of respiration, energy is taken into the body and is distributed by the heart through the entire arterial circulation. Another important source of energy is nutrition. We are not certain that direct exposure to the sun is as good a source of energy as was once supposed. The present tendency is to regard this as not the best form, and it is frequently accompanied by fatigue. And too much exposure seemingly causes certain structures or materials in the body to be stimulated to an exaggerated degree. The best sources of energy, therefore, arise from the mixture or the normal life of the person. In our normal living, under normal conditions, we have certain resources supplied by nutrition, by respiration, by light, air, and sun. We also have certain relaxations and repose, and it is during the period of sleep that the magnetic field does most of its repair work upon the ordinary wear and tear of the day. If the person, therefore, lives a relatively normal life, his energy supplies will be reasonably adequate, or will respond very quickly to any form of specialized therapy. Today, the problem of normal living is becoming a very serious one, and most persons do not feel today that they are living normal and contented lives. As a result, there is continual depletion of energy without adequate replenishment. One of the processes of the body, of course, which requires a great deal of energy, is the support of the intricate structure by means of which the mind operates upon the brain. This energy requirement is much greater than that necessary for the use of a pick and shovel, but a more refined type of energy is required. And as this must be refined from grosser forms of energy, it is evident that the refined part will not be as great in quantity as that from which it was refined. Thus, the need for the control and direction of energy resources, particularly at different periods of life, failure to adjust adequately and properly to the changing pattern of years, can result in serious energy depletions. Having once come into a general understanding of the theme or subject under consideration, we can practice in a simple and ordinary way a great many health-promoting procedures. We can, for example, watch against such intemperances as may be corruptive of energy. We can control to the best of our ability mental and emotional excesses, and also negative mental and emotional attitudes. We can seek for that tranquility which is normalcy of function. Every sacred book of the world has preached man's interior peace. This inner peace does not mean stagnation. It means adjustment with life, acceptance of the will of heaven, the recognition of Tao, which in Taoist philosophy becomes a kind of cosmic magnetism, or a universal energy which moves through space through the fields of the magnetic currents. If, as the result of certain specialized problems, we may have certain attitudes the magnetist will tell us there are things we can do that will help. One of the ways in which magnetism has been controlled, particularly in Asia, is through visualization. Visualization is a process of imposing upon the consciousness the picture of the state of well-being. Visualization, then, in connection with a wound, is the inner process of becoming aware that the wound is naturally and normally healing. If this is merely stated as a platitude, it is comparatively meaningless. But if it is held as a fact in consciousness, it will affect the availability of magnetism. For the magnetic field will accept the pattern and move to fulfill it. Just in the same way, if a person inwardly experiences by a suspended but purposeful effort the tranquility of his own consciousness, if he will visualize himself as in a state of adjustment with life, he will find it easier and easier to attain this state in his outward experience. Thus, visualization means to see the thing as it should be. Now, we may not always know just what it should be, and our visualization does not have to be ultimate. Our visualization of a boil would be fairly easy. We know what it should be. It should not be there, as far as our comfort is concerned. But it is there because of a cause. Therefore, visualization does not frustrate cause. It does not assume that the boil has no right to be there. It cannot do this and accept natural law. But it does visualize within the person an attitude, a condition, a state of being in which the suspension of negative factors removes the cause of the boil and results in the visualization of that kind of peace of soul and peace of mind which is not likely to cause boils, or if they do exist, will most quickly promote their healing by removing the negative factor, and also by that complete relaxation which permits the energy field to move into the area of the boil and do the remedial work. It is also possible for a person or a magnetic healer to temporarily stimulate the energy field around the boil, causing more magnetism to gather there, and in this way to hasten the processes of recuperation. This hastening is not an unnatural or an abnormal one. It is simply a hastening of the natural curative processes of life itself. In alchemy, one of the ancient formulas was that man perfects nature. Man working as the handmaiden of nature, cooperating with all natural processes, obeying to the best of his abilities all natural laws, releases in his own life and in the lives of those around him all of the energy available in his constitution. This energy moves like a cleansing ocean, magnetism burning up corruption, clearing it, taking it away, returning it to the great mystery of the solar power in which it is incinerated and removed. This energy, if given all possible and reasonable support by man, will do its work better, more quickly, than it can accomplish this work if it must at the same time fight against a group of negative reactions. Thus, therapy begins with tranquility. It begins with the gradual development of this consciousness of hope, faith, and love, by means of which the person achieves a rapport with life itself. And this life, thus coming in, without interference or interruption, without being wasted or lost through excessive expenditures that are meaningless, this life accomplishes its perfect works. And it was one of the beliefs of the ancient magnetists that God and nature intended man to be well. Sickness is not any more a natural state of man than war is a natural state of nations or crime a natural state of society. Sickness is the result of man being unable, as yet, to perfectly understand the rules governing health, or in one way or another, for selfish or even unselfish reasons, violating those rules. Such violations may appear to be justified, as in the case of the physician, who may exhaust himself sitting up with the sick. Or it may not appear to be justified, as in the case of intemperance and general waste of energy. But whatever be the cause, the energy that is used in one way cannot be used in another. The more our legitimate demands upon energy may be, the more heavily our profession or our life calls upon our vital resources, the more we must protect these with our attitudes. The individual who does nothing might have greater liberty to make mistakes than the person whose energy is constantly required. But by the proper direction of energy, through attitude, particularly through these attitudes recommended by Paul, faith, hope, and love, man living in these moods, in these ways, and achieving a certain tranquility in his own nature, will find that his energy is greater, and that when emergency arises, his recuperation is more rapid, that he is be less likely to infections and corruptions of the flesh, and also less likely to create those emotional and mental situations which must require still more expenditure of energy to mend or correct. Thus, magnetism becomes a kind of conscience, a censorship upon all action. And for those who keep its rules, by obeying the principles of the powers which move and direct energy, it becomes a kindly and helpful friend, a source of life and sustenance. But if it is outraged, it turns upon the person who breaks its rules, not because it does not like them, but because they have set up obstructions to energy. And in religion, to set up an obstruction to energy means to set up an obstruction to God. To set up an obstruction in the body means that there will be somewhere an inadequacy of the soul. So in these thoughts and in this type of thinking, magnetism becomes a field for science, also for philosophy, and for religion. And it becomes one simple key to how the average person can help himself, if he is so minded, in many small ways. And if he can do this successfully in many small ways, he may prevent part at least of the need for having something done in a big way. As often these small causes contribute together to some serious consequence, so the correction of small mistakes will help to maintain the grand economy of the complete person. Well, I think our time is up, and that is all we can do for this time. Now we're going to give you 2 weeks' vacation on Wednesday evenings. And then we're going to start a new series here, which I hope will prove of general interest to all of you. I don't have a program of the series at the moment, but I know what they are about. We're going to deal with the problem of the mandalas, the meditation disciplines, diagrams, and symbols of Eastern peoples, as these are used in various religious, philosophical, and mystical researches, conditions, and devotions. And we believe this will be one of the most interesting series we've given, so we hope you'll all be there. And we thank you very much.